know what happens to a woman or a man under the influence of a substance they cannot stop using of their own free will. The substance hijacks the mind and steals the soul. But there is much more to a substance use disorder than the substance. There are the emotions and the feelings, the actions or the behaviors that go along with addiction, and they often are as toxic as the substance itself. Welcome to Let's Talk, a podcast produced and brought to you by Hazel and Betty Ford. I'm your host, William C. Moyers. And today, to discuss shame and guilt with substance use disorders, is my guest and my colleague, Sarah Wicks, a clinical psychologist in mental health at Hazel and Betty Ford. Welcome, Sarah.
Thank you.
Tell me, why do shame and guilt go along with substance use issues?
They go hand in hand. The one cannot survive without the other, it's been said. Addiction and shame and guilt. Shame is one of the most universal human emotions, regardless of addiction or not, as well. It's been found across all cultures around the world, and most of us have it to some varying degree or another. If you don't, that's probably an interesting other clinical issue to not have it. But the key is, how do we work with it so that it doesn't control us, and that we can live with it.
And the guilt piece.
Yeah. So differences between shame and guilt, they're quite different, actually. And shame is more along the lines of I am bad. Guilt is I did something bad, right? I mean, a lot of this stuff comes from Brene Brown, my personal hero when it comes to this shame and guilt. And so the shame part, when you're stuck in shame and feeling like a bad person, that's actually, there's research correlating that with higher rates of addiction, depression, violence, bullying, even suicide. But the interesting thing is, higher levels of guilt don't have the same effect on us. Higher levels of guilt actually promotes the ability to be more trustworthy, to live with integrity, and more empathy for others when we are able to access some, what I would call like a healthy level of guilt. So actually part of the work that we do at Hazelden and at my personal work as a psychologist is helping people actually transform their shame into guilt. And my clients, yeah, I know, they're like, excuse me, can't we just get rid of all of that? Right? But guilt is what allows us to take some accountability for our actions.
Wow, I didn't realize that. I've always been told that shame is a result of a feeling, guilt is a result of an action. But it doesn't really matter where it comes from, it's that it's there, right?
It's that it's there, and that the shame is all encompassing. Shame is a very social emotion as well. It's a feeling that's very primal and primitive, that we will be rejected from the group, which is a feeling of belonging is just critical for us as human beings, even though in modern times we may like to believe that we can be so self-sufficient and self-reliant, but it's such a critical emotional need to belong. And with shame, that's what feels threatened. With guilt, it's like, well, I screwed up, I made a mistake, and I can work on this, I can make it right, I can make some changes. Shame doesn't make a lot of room for change, guilt does. It gives us a path for change.
So shame and guilt are natural to the human species, of course.
Absolutely.
We all have it. But when it comes to its intimate connection to a substance use issue, talk more about that.
As addiction is progressing, what happens is the individual, it starts with some harmless intentions, some fun, some, drinking, drugs. It can feel good, pleasure, sure. And then when it hits a certain point where this individual is engaging in behaviors over and over again that go against their core values, that's where the shame starts to build up. The farther and farther the person's behaviors get from their values. And that's where, and then actually using more of the substance to try to deal with that incredible pain of the shame then keeps the vicious cycle going.
I see. And the substance might work, quote unquote, for a while, but ultimately it doesn't.
Yeah, that's the problem. It works great in the moment. It takes away whatever's there. It's fine. I don't care anymore. Or I'm feeling something different. So, and then the shame is just waiting for that individual after. And that's where the worse that cycle gets, the stronger it gets, the more frequent, then we end up with this self-loathing that they talk about.
Which is why in substance treatment, it's not enough to just address the use of the substance. You also have to address the feelings, the emotions that go along with it, i.e. shame and guilt.
And so the first step in addressing it, I believe, in that the cure for shame is love.
The cure for shame is love.
The cure for shame is love. Dr. Omar Manajwala, I have to credit him for that when he worked with Hazelden. Yes. He said it, really stuck with me, always has. And the thing about the initial stages of getting help for addiction is that the people that are closest to the person suffering from the addiction are not the best people to give unconditional love. They've been hurt. They've been probably betrayed, probably lied to. They're just not in a position to provide the love that's needed for somebody to kind of drop their shame or kind of ease their way through it. And so it is important to actually get folks surrounded by other people who suffer with addiction and build that sense of community independent from their closest family.
So group is a critical antidote to shame and guilt. What about 12-step facilitation or just the working of the program, if you will? How does the 12 steps work in dealing with shame and guilt?
Well, so I'm a psychologist, so this is the background that I'm coming from. So
long time, you've been around a long time.
And been at Hazelden a long time, and so the way I view the 12 steps is kind of a recipe for how to come to terms with shame and how to build an unconditional sense of belonging. That's how I see like the higher power relationship. It's finding a source of unconditional acceptance, love, and belonging, whatever that source may be. And I think that can really help reduce shame and help build a sense of self-acceptance. It's not about, in treatment, we're not trying to help people, and in 12 steps, and in the meetings, in the rooms, they're not trying to make everybody feel great about themselves all the time. It's more a culture of, you know what, we all screw up, and welcome to the club.
We're all imperfect.
We're all in
We're
it
human.
together. We're all in it together. Yeah.
Yes.
And it's not about like, I'm great, I'm smart, it's about like, we are just all doing the best we can, and we sometimes have good days and sometimes screw up, and we love you anyway.
What about the use of medications in the treatment and recovery process? Can a medication help to address somebody's shame and guilt, or is it really going to be about a therapeutic experience?
So shame can actually be so painful and unbearable to experience that we build walls around it to protect ourselves from the actual experience of shame. And what do those walls look like? Anger, depression, social isolation, social anxiety. So there's symptoms that can show up, not always as a result of a defense mechanism with shame, but sometimes as a result of that. And so the medications, there's no medication to treat shame directly, but can help with those symptoms. And then you can really kind of, I like to talk with people new in recovery who just maybe recently started a medication. I'll say, okay, let's figure out your baseline here. When you're sober, when you're not on the drugs and alcohol, and when you're taking prescribed appropriate medication, let's see what your baseline is as far as how you feel emotionally, what's your relationship to yourself and your relationship to others.
Yeah. What role does a higher power play in helping people to come to terms with their shame and their guilt?
Well, that's, what we touched on before with, as a psychologist, the way I see higher power is this source of unconditional love and belonging. And because we're all going to have times when we're lonely and when we're alone, we're all going to experience rejection, failure, loss. It's sometimes my work with clients actually feels a bit depressing initially because I'm helping them accept the realities of this. We like to pretend as a society that if I'm doing all the right things, I can be happy and comfortable at all times. Just not true.
Right.
So how do we get through the hard times? How do we deal with our own mistakes, our own failings? I think that's where a higher power can come in.
And I think what you're also saying is that putting down the substance, the marijuana, the cocaine, the opiate, and beginning the recovery process, that's an important start, but that the process of dealing with guilt and shame is not going to just come and go as soon as you put the substance down. It takes time.
It takes time, and usually there's other ways of hiding the shame from yourself that will show up. Maybe other compulsive behaviors, maybe judgmental attitudes towards other people. This is where the ego can come in. So it really is not just abstaining from the substance, but building a program of recovery is an entirely different kind of undertaking that I just love helping people do that because it can be so transformative.
It's a journey, not a destination.
Exactly, always.
You've got to tell me about this term, self-concept yogi.
Okay, so self-concept yogi, so this comes from, I completely made it up.
Really?
Yes, but there's some good basis to it. There's some good scientific background to it. So I made up the term, but it comes from my background working with acceptance and commitment therapy and my own yoga practice and being a lifelong athlete and yoga, whatever. Yeah. So acceptance and commitment therapy, ACT, has 6 core processes of change, one of which is called self as context. And so this goes back to the thing I was talking about before, where self as context means that I'm not trying to feel great about myself at all times. I'm trying to be open and flexible and accepting of whoever I am, however I show up on any given day, knowing I'm going to have some better days and some bad days, and I'm going to have some successes and failures. And so the yoga practice physically involves balance, flexibility, tuning in to yourself, and knowing when you can stretch yourself to your limits and when you need to take it easy on yourself. And it's all with the physical body. And I propose that we do the same thing mentally, and that's really a recipe for a pretty great way to live.
And it works.
It does.
But it takes time. It takes practice.
Oh, yeah.
It takes community. Nobody overcomes shame and guilt on their own, but they have to be part of the process of change.
Well, and they have to have the courage to be vulnerable.
The courage to be vulnerable.
If you're not vulnerable, if you're not honest and open, you're not giving anybody a chance to show you love.
Yeah. Well, we really appreciate you being here today and showing us the way to love and showing us the way to how we're all in this together. Because, we often think about shame and guilt as being intimately personal, and it is, but we're all intimately personal with shame and guilt. And you don't have to have a drug or alcohol problem for it to be debilitating in terms of shame and guilt.
Right.
So recovery is all about people trying to improve themselves, overcoming their shame and their guilt, whether they have a substance use issue or not.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well, thank you for bringing that great credibility that you have through your own commitment, your own clinical expertise, your passion for helping people to change. Sarah Wicks, thanks for being with us today. And thanks to all of you for joining us, for tuning in. And remember, if you or a loved one need help for addiction, don't wait. Ask for help. It is available, treatment works, and recovery is possible. We'll see you again.